Not here. I'm not clear if Earl will be here or not. I've not heard anything, but we do have a quorum. First order of business is to accept the minutes from our last meeting.
I move.
Second. Moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
And roll call, Fred from the call. You're muted if you said anything.
He is muted.
All right, maybe Fred is, I know Fred has training going on right now.
Oh, he just.
Fred, minutes.
Yep, I second that.
Great, thanks, Fred.
I
Unanimous.
couldn't hear everything, that's why.
Okay. So I don't think Genevieve is on the call. So we do have, I believe, all the legislation for the Maine State Ferry Service now out and available. And I sort of was looking through this and categorized them into a few sort of categories. You have the LD 841 studying EMS provision to island communities, which has already left committee with a recommended ought to pass. You have two bills that are related to either a new ferry oversight committee or more consultation / power given to the Ferry Service Advisory Board that's already in existence. Then you have two bills that sort of are centered around employee recruitment. I don't believe those necessarily have gotten a lot of traction. You have two bills that require ferries to dock on islands, both with different language. One seems to be sort of more robust than the other. One is very sort of cursory and says requires, the other gives the rulemaking procedure and things that you would have to do if you wanted to change that rule. There's also bills about expanding the Matinicus schedule, which has been dialed back from 36 trips a year to something to be agreed between the community and the ferry service as to what's reasonable, but more than what they have, which I know is maybe once a month or even maybe twice a month in the summer and down to once a month or less in the winter.
I think it's right.
So it's not a lot, but not being bumped up to 36 trips a year, which maybe was not really what the community wanted, asked for, or would be useful given how the island is set up now. So there's also bills about, there's another bill, I believe, about giving ferry service personnel lifetime passes on the ferry service. There's other things there. There's other things that we have talked about here, which are not in bills. One of them would be about the requirement of providing emergency response. This is something that we've talked about, something that Fred talked about a lot, and that I know Peter talked about a lot in terms of what that would look like. There's another thing that I brought up, and John and I and Peter all have talked about, which would be designating repair and unfunded pension liability costs in the budget as essentially capital expenditures. So I'm just trying to outline what I think, all the things we've talked about, what the playing field is and where we are right now. And we're sort of tasked with what we want to support, what we want to, I say, recommend to the select board, I believe is what to support. And so right now, I feel like there already has the bill about studying EMS, provision to island communities already left committee with a recommended ought to pass. That's something that we ought to support. That is what is going to be the sort of the information gathering process that I think ultimately will lead to the ask about the provision of emergency response services to island communities. And I feel like that is the first step in that process to have that study done and to use the data that comes from that study as to essentially push for guaranteed emergency response. And I know Fred has talked about how he has had emergency calls. Those have continued to work. There really is no animosity. He works very well with the ferry service. And so, at least for right now, it is not what we would want for a guarantee of emergency response by the ferry, but it is working right now. And perhaps the best thing to do is to let the study go forward and see what that turns up and use that as a mechanism for legislation during the next legislative period.
Just to clarify on that one, though, that one's already had its public hearing, right? And Genevieve was there in person, testified on our behalf, and so
Yes.
I don't know that
We don't need,
I don't know that
Well-
it may not, well, I guess it's unclear, because it doesn't look like the transportation schedule has been released yet for next week, but I wouldn't anticipate it showing back up again for a public hearing.
so all that is to say, I don't believe, I haven't heard from Genevieve that we have the final day or schedule for what they're terming ferry day, where they try to take up all of the bills related to the ferry. But so there's that has already been, Genevieve has testified on behalf of the island for that. I'm not clear, as Jay mentioned, whether that comes up. Then you have ferry oversight, whether or not the town wants to support additional oversight, either through a new board or through the expanded role of the advisory board. And then you have two bills about requiring the ferry dock on the island. The others about recruitment, I'm not clear where the other islands land on some of these issues. But I think, at least for me, the thing that we really need to push to support is requiring ferries to dock on the island. I think that is, I think that the ferry service is not planning on doing that in the near term, but it seems like while we have a bill, we might as well put that in place now, so to the extent they want to make a change, we're dealing with either a statutory change or a larger scale rulemaking change that requires more than them on a whim deciding to move the ferries, which I think is good overall. And again, I think we're sort of unique to other islands because we're not as far from the mainland. But it certainly would make emergency response slower, and I would say it depends. I mean, we don't really know what that looks like, but I don't think we want to get into what that looks like necessarily without a much more thought out process from the ferry service, which is, not happening at this point in terms of, go ahead, John.
Just a question, is there any scuttlebutt on what the status of these two bills requiring the vessels to be built on islands is? And, I mean, where are we?
So
Does it look like they're gonna clear committee ought to pass, or?
I don't know that,
I don't think we know until
Till it
so the
happens?
weather report was there was a lot of back and forth about whether or not the DOT was going to support or even fight about that or not. And initially, my understanding was Bruce Van Note had made a representation that they were not pursuing that. And then later on, he was called at a North Haven Select Board meeting. And that's what John Emerson circulated. His understanding, what Bruce had said there was he was planning on doing that and he wanted to use Islesboro as a test case at some point in the future.
2 to 3 years.
Yeah.
So I would imagine the DOT is going to come out against both bills and say they want to use this as a test case, like, let's pilot something before we legislate any change and see what happens. We'll report back in 4 years.
Yeah.
That's
or-
my guess.
Or alternatively, this can all be addressed in
The
state
state,
41, which has been already cleared to pass by the committee, right?
Right.
right.
That's what I would suspect would be very likely.
Yeah, but I do think, so with that, the bill that does allow for, I believe it's 1231. Let me see if I can pull up that text. Is it 1231? No, 1231 is the very basic, requires boats to be on the island, so it's 947. So let me just pull up the text of that really quick. And the text of that is, overnight, the Department of Transportation shall allow a ferry vessel operating under this section dock overnight at its island port. Or mainland port if it's the common practice. And then they give an exception, you can dock on a mainland port for emergency situations or extreme weather events. And then it goes on to the department may adopt rules necessary to implement this section. Rules adopted pursuant to this section are routine technical rules as defined in chapter 5. So we might want to tweak language there.
So
That's on
What's-
1247?
So they're doing that,
That's 947.
so that would mean that it would not be subject to the APA.
Right, we would want, what is the other classification that's not routine?
I don't know, but it's important.
Yeah, we want them to go through a full rulemaking process to make a change to where the ferries are located. And not have it be the kind of thing where they make a decision and they have deference. And they just, whatever they decide sort of goes unless it's, you know, have to be totally off the wall, I would think, to push back.
But that 947 is the one that is very, you know, it is, softer language than
It
the
has,
other LD.
right, it has softer, the other one just says, these are the islands and the ferries live on those islands. And it lists three, I believe, Swans, North Haven and Islesboro.
Yeah,
And it says the ferries live.
Island.
What number's that one, 12 something?
What was that?
1231?
12, what number is that, the more?
1231
Okay,
and 947 are the two that
right,
speak to, I mean, and I would think that those two bills are going to merge at some point. They're not gonna take up two separate bills on nearly identical things. They're going to have to come to grips with what the language will be for both of those. They're very similar, but
yeah.
they're not gonna,
Well, I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but when and if we know when the quote ferry day unquote is going to be, it would probably behoove us to be there and say, whatever you do, make it subject to the Administrative Procedures Act so we can have a voice in it,
right,
if
Yeah.
it does pass.
that's right, that's exactly, we wanna be at the table, we're ready to participate and wanna be at the table for that conversation, if a conversation is happening.
Right,
Right, we don't want we don't want it to be the ferry service. We don't want it to be just the advisory board who they say that they brought up to and then made a decision, right? We want full blown.
yeah, we don't
hearings.
want one of these, like I brought it up at the advisory board
Exactly.
meeting 6 months ago and nobody said anything, so
Right,
it's
and now,
okay.
exactly, right. We don't want that. We want something, we want something real.
Right,
You know, another. Anyway, before we go on, anybody else have more thoughts on that? I mean, it's a free-for-all discussion about this at this point.
Well, no, just when it comes to ferry sleeping on shore, I think we need to detail how the crews are gonna be required and how they're gonna be compensated for being required. Those two things.
What do you mean for being?
For being, right now, the crews aren't required to do an emergency midnight run.
Right,
So we want them required, we want that to be part of the job in writing, no ifs, ands, or buts.
right. So, but
And-
I think that's what comes out of the study that we're talking about of 841, about the provision of emergency services to unbridged islands. I think that's one of the things that they will be looking at in that study.
Okay, and along with them being required, we now need to say how they're gonna be compensated for being required.
Right, and so I would say, you know, it's probably outside of the scope of what we can push for to decide which one would be for a crew that has to stay on the island and do emergency runs, right? That's gonna be part of contract negotiations with the union. It's gonna be a much more involved thing than we can say, this is what it would be, I think. It's gonna be hard to codify that and not have that be part of the direct purview of the DOT and the ferry service.
Well, I agree it will be, but I think that if we say we expect this to happen and no wiggle room around it, it should happen.
So one of the things that I think one of the reasons I think that we ought to let the LD 841 address that before we push for something like that is to see what that comes up with on any number of fronts in terms of what it might cost. Two, whether or not they could even get a union to agree to such a thing. Right, there's all sorts of wrinkles that we don't really know about the requirement, then you run into what the Coast Guard might say about the 24-hour rule, you run into.
At that point, I asked the Coast Guard in Belfast like 3 weeks ago, how does the 24-hour rule work? And they said, in words to the effect that I will open up such a can of worms and they're studying it and they will get back to me any day now, but they haven't yet.
And so another wrinkle that happens with the ferry service and the 24-hour rule is that the ferries don't all have the same length day.
Right.
And the
right.
ferry service has got a round hole that they're jamming all the pegs into, right? They're not trying to make a special rule for Islesboro emergency response because our day is shorter because the run is shorter. They are trying to make a one size fits all for all of the islands, right? And as a result, Fred, as you've heard him talk about, he calls every time that there is an emergency for the ferry to get approval from the Coast Guard for the ferry service to make that run. And at least my understanding of the 12-hour rule is often that would not be required because it wouldn't even put the crew past that. They wouldn't even be trying to get an exception. They're within the normal operating.
I agree. In the merchant marine, we have a rule that says you have to get 7 hours of unbroken rest.
Yeah.
So 7 hours during the day, you're done. And depending on when the ferry makes a midnight run, they get that or they don't get that, you know.
Yeah, so
And that's what I'm asking them for help with. Are we requiring our crews to get 7 hours of unbroken rest?
Right.
Or
And
is it
so-
just 12 hours and 24?
And so it's gonna be really hard for us to show up with a statute and say, this is what's required, because the legislators, I don't think are gonna be comfortable saying that the town of Islesboro knows what the 12-hour rule means to the Coast Guard, right? I think that the idea that they put a study together and that they investigate and address all these things and say, here are the hurdles that we have to overcome, here's what we need. And use that as a basis for trying to put legislation together. And again, I think some of the things you're not gonna have compensation in a statute. That is not gonna happen, if only because they would need to change it as the cost of living goes up, as things change, and they don't wanna change that with the statutory change every time. I don't believe that you see compensation in this
Understood.
section, but go ahead, Shay.
No, I was gonna agree, I feel like, while it's not perfect and not having kind of the strongest language possible that we have, that the emergency runs are required to do, it seems like right now from Fred that it's generally working, that he's happy with the way the current system works, and so if we could get one of those two bills to pass, even just as this system is currently working, let's not break it.
Well, there's a big question of whether or not they do the first ferry run. And if they do a midnight run and cancel the 7:30 and 8 o'clock ferries, that's a horrible pain in the neck to everybody.
So my understanding is that as a general rule, the island is okay with having a first boat canceled if it meant that someone who needed an emergency trip went on the emergency trip. I don't really hear a lot of pushback about that personally.
But it's not clear to me that we have to expect that. It may be that the Coast Guard says, yeah, they can do a 1 hour run at night and still make the 7:30 run in the morning.
Right.
And that's, I think, what we're looking for them from. What we're,
I agree with you that it may not be necessary, and I think right now where it lands is really the captain's discretion. About when, and they may have some protocol that they follow about the trip happened after 11 o'clock at night, that means we're gonna cancel as a matter of course, to give people rest. You know, I don't know what they do necessarily, but they don't always cancel because sometimes.
you're right. They don't. I think they did one last week or the week before where they did not cancel the first runs.
And I think if they have an emergency run, let's say at 5 o'clock at night, I don't believe they cancel the first boat the next day.
I think you're probably right, but,
But
You're right.
so, but again, I mean, we could get more clarification on that, and this is something that I think a study would put together about what the
Okay.
parameters are,
Okay.
about like, hey, you don't have to cancel, and why don't we put. So you easily could build in some discretion for the captain anyway, because it's hard to envision all of the circumstances that might come up in an emergency run. You could try to define it as narrowly as possible, but let's say, for example, that somebody left and then they had to wait for the ambulance, or the ambulance broke down on the boat and they couldn't get back, so that the timing was such that was really stretched. I mean, there's just like weird intricacies that could come up that are hard to imagine.
Yep.
That you would want to have some discretion for the captain to say, hey, the crew is tired, we need to give them an extra hour this morning. And that's, I think that's reasonable. I mean, I don't think you're gonna find ferry captains sort of abusing that. I think that, yeah, I'm comfortable with them having that kind of discretion for the morning boats. And again, I feel like, I hear this at the advisory board too, and other members, that if morning boats are canceled for emergency runs, the preference is, let's cancel the boat and get somebody to the hospital who needs to go to the hospital.
Well, I agree with that. Yeah,
Yeah.
sure, I understand that.
But, and again, maybe we don't have to cancel, and that's another conversation that we could have.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, to me, it just seems like we have a much higher likelihood of having success in having one of those two bills pass if it is not aligned with a fiscal note. If it's just saying, we're keeping status quo. And we will learn more about what any fiscal note and change in policy needs to be through this study, which has already been suggested to move forward.
Yeah, I think in the current political climate, asking for more money, for more pay for emergency response. It undoubtedly, so I can't say that it would be a hard no, but it would undoubtedly mean higher ferry rates. Right, the rates would go up to cover that cost.
but we still want the wiggle room taken out of it. That ferry crews are expected to make midnight runs.
That is the end goal. I mean, that is the end goal of having guaranteed a guarantee within reason, right? You have weather events that you can't, there's things that, broken down boats, all those things that can happen.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, the captain should always have the right to cancel due to weather.
Yeah.
I mean, that's his call.
Yeah.
They did that last week, I forget. It was Sunday, 5 o'clock.
Yeah,
So
so
it
I
didn't
mean,
run.
but I think that that's the ultimate end goal, but how we get there is gonna be a function of, I think, the study and what that says, but I think.
I think you may be right. My only concern on that is if they fold 947 or 1231 into the discussion that is being proposed by 841, there's a good chance that none of us or anyone from this island is not going to be on that study group.
Yeah, so I think that 841 has had, I have to look at the amendments that Genevieve sent. Well, let me try, she emailed a picture of a red line of that, I believe.
Okay. Well, almost, did I get that?
I think,
Okay. I'll take it in.
but I don't, know.
I haven't been keeping up. Well, that would be my only concern, so.
So,
And I don't think it's absolutely a prerequisite that an Islesboro representative be on that committee, but I would want to be able to be heard, which I assume would be the case.
so, right, it would be, they've changed it to be representative from an island community representing a representative providing EMS services on an island served by the Maine State Ferry Service. So again, right, we don't necessarily have a seat at that table,
Right.
but we do have representative people who are facing similar things.
Well, except that now that Commissioner Van Note has decided that we're gonna be the little test case. That, that enters into the equation
Yeah.
as well.
So I think Genevieve can probably advise us on this. I think will be opportunities to at least suggest names for people that we think would be good and willing to serve on that task force. And it doesn't guarantee us anything, but I think that we should certainly.
I'm not raising it to
Yeah.
insist
Yeah,
that we
yeah.
be on it. I just raise it to perhaps suggest that we better be ready to be agile.
Yeah. And I think it'd probably be a heavy lift to say that we demand a spot on that committee.
No, it would.
Yeah.
It would, but.
Yeah.
But I am concerned when I hear that Commissioner Van Notes decided that the test case will be our island.
I mean, I feel like that would make it more likely that it would be a representative from Islesboro that would be on that committee.
Yeah.
Potentially, maybe that's overly optimistic, but.
I think it might be.
Yeah.
But it's just something I think we should all be aware of,
Mhm.
so, and we don't even know when Ferry Day is, right?
Yeah, I don't believe, we
Yeah,
thought it
I
was the
think you're
20
right.
the 29th was what it was being projected as, but I don't believe it's actually been scheduled.
Okay,
And so that would be what, next Tuesday potentially, but we don't know. So.
Not
I
much
think-
time.
Yeah,
no,
I think sort of thinking about some of the other things that we talked about in terms of funding, I'm a little bit, no, I don't think that we ought to be pushing the unfunded pension liability or repairs. I think if we are opening the broader conversation specifically about finances, that there's a risk that things go worse than they are. The status quo is, worse than the status quo.
yeah, and
I don't know. I don't know what you think about that. I mean,
I tend to agree with you. I tend to think it's not a mere coincidence that while we're spending all our time on where the ferry spends the night, we're getting fastballed by the new tariff proposal,
yeah,
but that's not, nothing over which we have any control.
But I don't think that it helps us to, I agree that I don't think it helps us to bring the tariff situation to any of our comments on these issues because it is kind of apples and oranges.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I don't know, does anybody have a thought about the Matinicus expanded schedule? Do we,
Well, Eva asked for it because she said they had construction going on this winter. And they just simply needed more boats. And it's my understanding that the boat that does Matinicus is just sitting there in Rockland, not doing much.
yes, I believe they only have one boat that can go into the Matinicus Harbor. Are
Yeah,
there
and it's
depth
just-
restrictions?
Yes.
Yeah, and it's a 100-ton boat, it's not doing anything else. So it doesn't sound like it's any hard thing for the ferry service to
Well,
do.
Captains and crews and,
They're all set up. The crews are unlicensed completely. And the captains just have 100-ton licenses. And there are 2 of them working in the office now that are,
Dan makes that run, Dan McNichol makes that run.
no, he's out of the picture now. There's 2 other guys that are doing it.
Oh, I thought Dan was captaining that run.
I,
Okay, no, just.
I don't
doesn't
think so.
matter.
I think that what they're doing it with is with 100-ton licenses. Because they designed that boat to be under the 100-ton rule.
I believe they decide every ferry to be under the 100-ton.
No, Maggie's, no, our boat is under 500.
So our boat is a
The
99.
George Mitchell. Yeah, the Maggie's 99, but that's,
But they require a higher license.
no, some of the other boats are over 200 tons,
They are.
200 gross, yeah. And I think the new boat, the George Mitchell that they designed and threw away is closer to 400.
So to me, something that I care less about testimony, although I think, maybe as a courtesy, it would make sense to reach out to Eva as another advisory board member, just to ask if there was any kind of, if she had if there's a way that we could help, and what her comments would be, and if she'd like for us to provide any kind of support in any way for her. But I have also heard that there are issues with that boat. And I guess that sort of concerns me more, just as far as, let's learn from one of the most recent boat builds and make some changes. And I think as we think about both where the ferry berths and potential damages to at least, the Maggie or a new boat, whenever a new boat can be afforded. To me, that sort of gets to the ferry advisory board role, and it seems like it would be helpful to get some more information and clarity about status and issues with the fleet.
Yeah.
You're talking about the brand new boat,
Yep, I think it was the Shay.
the shed,
Yeah.
yeah. What's,
I mean, I just heard that it was taking on water and had to turn around on a Matinicus run like last week.
Well, that's not ideal.
No. That it was, there
Really?
was drainage issues.
um,
I mean, it was
And they
sinking.
were lucky, and then they were lucky to have an engineer on board. That's what I heard just through
Fail.
the.
Best Bill Trump is a scared man with a bucket.
I feel like on a boat that size, that might not be enough.
Yes.
So,
So anyway, I mean, like, that's all just scuttlebutt, but I do, but I think there is. It raises real concerns to me about, to your concerns and frustration with the ferry designs, but also just in, our understanding of what the repairs and maintenance that is required on the fleet that is driving the, tariffs.
I think that the boat that has historically served Matinicus is one of the oldest boats in the fleet.
yeah,
Is that
it's 60 years old.
The Libby? Is it the Libby?
Yeah.
And now it's brand new. Now it's the Shay, right?
Right.
It's brand new.
They took the Libby out of service.
Okay.
It's the Shay that's sitting down there in Rockland now.
And the
Yeah.
Shay is what's gonna be making runs going forward to Matinicus?
Yeah.
Regularly. Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah.
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 It's because it got christened and then it sat down there for quite some time while they were getting it, actually ready to go.
Okay.
I guess they forgot something. Apparently. Ooh, that's kind of scary.
So where does that leave us? And hey, Fred, I know you're zoomed in. I know you have other things going. Do you want to chime in on your thoughts on this?
Hold on, I had a hard time getting to my microphone. What was the question, Gabe?
Oh, I just said, I know you're zoomed in and have other things going on, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to chime in about legislation, and really, it's a free-for-all in terms of what your thoughts are on this.
I think that if you can achieve the boat staying on Islesboro overnight, that's the biggest thing that's gonna happen. As far as like the ferry cruise running, I think that the fact that we're all working towards a same cause, because they want to keep the boat here too. I think that as long as we're not calling them out too much, just when, like on that flow chart I showed you guys, I think that they will continue to run for us. I really believe that. I mean, I think that from what I've seen from them the last month or so, I can't discredit them for anything. They've been doing what we needed them to do. As far as as far as I think that's pretty much the only thing I feel about is if we can secure that boat to have it on Islesboro, that's where we're gonna need to be. Um, I I don't know what you're gonna be looking at for personnel in years to come, and that's gonna be an issue too. Right now, we're actually the ambulance service is sitting at the biggest roster it has since 2004 when that first group I put through EMT school. We have almost 20 people now. And
Great.
I don't know if I'm going to be able to sustain those numbers, as you can imagine, 10 years down the road, or somebody else is going to be able to sustain those numbers. But I think just the effort of trying to keep that boat on Islesboro, I don't know about being somebody's guinea pig for a project. I don't know much about that, but I think if we could secure the boat on the island with the crews that we have now, I really think you've got to put word in, and we've talked about it before, put wording in that tariff of how they're going to run for us. I mean, time goes over the bridge, and then they start doing the same thing all over again. And I think something has to happen in that tariff or some kind of written policy that says, that we will go through the process to contact them. We understand what their concerns are because we never did not say that we didn't care about their concerns. We get that. We don't want them running when they've been we did that one night and ended up having a baby at 2 o'clock in the morning that he didn't run. And I didn't blame them when they didn't run because they had already been in the bay with us three times. So, we've got a good group of private boats that a good group of people that we can depend on, and we have Quicksilver, and unless they're emergent, we're not going to call out the ferry boat. There's people that think we should be calling out the ferry boat for every run, and you're never going to get that. I can't imagine you're going to ever get that. So why push buttons that you're not gonna get, it could actually make it worse. But that's my thought. You asked me, and that's what
All
I
right.
think.
Thanks, Brett, I appreciate it.
Yep.
So with that, I think, one of the things that we want to convey probably to Genevieve is that it sounds like the priority for the town is, at this point, the two bills that require the ferry dock on the island, and however those are merged and whatever the final language is. But I think we want to support that, and that's really what we are most interested in supporting. I am,
Might mention to Genevieve the business about the routine, quote, 947 has that language about
yeah,
routine to kind of get around the APA, so.
Yeah.
That's, I think, worthy of comment to her.
yes.
I'm not sure, make a big deal about it now, but just so she's aware of it.
Yeah, we want as much safeguarding as we can in that legislation to say the boats are gonna come here, and if there are gonna be changes, there's gonna be a rulemaking process where people have an opportunity to be heard and they have to have hearings, and it's not, yeah, as we talked about
Yeah.
before, the DOT deciding to do whatever they feel like and saying, oh, you guys are guinea pigs and we're gonna just see how it works for.
Well, I'm a little concerned about the way they've been approaching the tariff situation, because they apparently are okay with publishing the proposed new rates and taking public comment on it, but in the meantime, definitions of things and other stuff seems to be becoming routine, quote unquote,
Right.
and it never was before.
Yeah.
So
Well-
that's pretty important.
It is, and you don't want things like definitions to change, which has already happened, without an opportunity to have that be part of what the discussion is, right? If the only discussion you have is the dollars and what they're doing is changing what vehicles apply for those categories, all of a sudden you might have a different,
Exactly,
which is already, it's already happened,
exactly.
so,
Hey, Gabe,
yes.
I wanted to bring one thing up. I actually want to remind everybody of something that's very important. Is not only do we have to worry about emergency medical runs, we're hinging everything right now on emergency medical runs. We've also got to consider what is Mert going to do if he needs additional equipment. Some of that equipment you have to drive, and it's happened before. We've had to call a ferry boat out after hours to bring over fire trucks to get equipment back. And then also, what is going to happen if I don't even really want to think of this, but if there was ever a mass casualty situation, how are we supposed to get ambulances in and ambulances out? Because in a mass casualty situation, our folks won't be transporting. We'll be doing all the components of a mass casualty. We'll need other ambulances and other fire departments and law enforcement to be able to come over and back us. That's why I've always been frustrated with this. I don't understand why it's okay for the town of Gardner to mutual aid Augusta, but it's not okay to have our mutual aid come on a ferry boat and come to the island and assist us. I mean, they're basically cutting us out of services that every other town in the state has a right to. So that's what I also want to remind. So please make sure that you tell them that this isn't just medical runs. This is fire department equipment. This is forestry equipment if there's a forest fire, which can happen anytime. This is also law enforcement equipment, TAC team equipment, in case there was ever an active shooter or a hostage situation. I think you're gonna make more sense with all of those situations that Islesboro, Vinyl Haven, North Haven, we don't have anybody to come in, because if they shut the boats down after hours, we won't be able to ever get those things, and you know that. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Fred. I know we've definitely been talking about this in the context of emergency runs, but there's a lot of other things that you listed that are very important, from fire to police resources, to forestry resources, to all the things that if you need equipment that the town doesn't have, then you need the ferry to make those things happen. And if you need it fast, then you need the ferry to do it and not wait for the next day or try to. I mean, I don't know what make do with lugging things that you can on small boats is often not a workable alternative.
Well, I think Fred raises a really, really good point, I think, because particularly as it pertains to us, because Rockland has a boat there. So if North Haven or Vinyl Haven needs law enforcement backup, needs, fire, fire backup. They got a boat that'll take them there. We don't have that, so, something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I guess my only caution is, I think it's important that we recognize how important that service is. But we also don't want to have them turn that around on us to say, okay, we'll keep the boat on the mainland. So that mutual aid can get there. I guess that's a question. I just want to be aware that
Yeah,
if they want to use Islesboro as a pilot, that might be fuel for that fire.
But if their crews are not housed in a facility right at Lincolnville Beach or within
Sure.
15 to 20 minutes of the ferry terminal, you're not going to get those crews to respond.
that's
If they're
right.
if they're up in Gardner Living, and then they don't have to answer that phone. There's no requirement. There's no contract. So I think that it's really important to keep the boat here, send it over to get the equipment like we've always done, and just do it that way. Thank you.
Fred, I will point out that at one of the meetings that Van Note spoke at, he talked about getting a house in Lincolnville to house crew. So hopefully that's part of his plan. I just throw that out. I mean, it makes it, that and the breakwater makes it a bloody expensive plan.
It's hard to know. On its face, to me, it seems almost unworkable and not going to make a situation any better in any respect. It's certainly not gonna save money, and it's not.
No.
And at least according to the crew surveys that have gone out now, is not going to help retain crew. I mean, you have to hope that when you spend a bunch of extra money and you alienate the crews that you have, you make it easier to find replacement crews because they don't have to live on the island. I mean, that's the only way I think you can spin that, which strikes me as perhaps unlikely. But anyway,
So if ferry day, when will our next meeting be? If ferry day is gonna be real next meeting?
well, we potentially won't have another meeting before Ferry Day, and there won't be another select board meeting before Ferry Day.
No, I mean, I do wonder if we should consider a meeting on Monday if we get. And maybe that's just a workshop so that we're strategizing our points so that we know that it's being hit on multiple fronts, but
Yeah, we should perhaps pencil in a meeting for Monday. Is there availability, Carrie, on Monday?
Planning board is at 5 o'clock.
Well, let's go over to the firehouse or something.
I won't be there.
What's that?
I'll have to be here for planning board. So, but it's just a workshop. You won't need me anyway.
We can meet at public safety. The fire department has their officers meeting, but I'm sure that to work on this effort is probably to them more important. So I can talk to Mert if you want me to, and you can meet over there.
All right, let's plan on that, Fred, and if there's trouble, if that doesn't work, just let me know. We could also think about the community center. I know Earl mentioned that we could probably make that happen over there too. So if it doesn't work for Mert, just let me know. We'll tentatively plan on it though.
Okay, sounds good.
Thanks. So Monday, 4:30,
4:30.
same time, same place.
That's the 28th.
Not same place.
Well, different. You know what I mean? It's an
I'm
expression.
gonna put that in my calendar where it is because I forgot this time.
Yeah.
I did also pencil you in for next Thursday. Here.
I
To
mean,
save the spot.
Let's leave it for now. And if we need to cancel it or want to cancel it, we can. But for right now, I mean, I will tonight send out an email to Genevieve, I think, and I'll try to recap right now. I mean, the priority for us right now is docking the boat on the island. That's really what we want to be pushing. And to the extent we might be interested in supporting other bills, I'm happy to reach out to Eva. It would be nice to get some additional support from other island communities, and I think we can get that on that. Now that we know what the ask is, I think we'd be able to reach out and try to get at least some written testimony from other islands in support of that, so can talk with Genevieve about that.
I guess the only ones that we really haven't talked about specifically is the idea of the advisory board. And I mean, to me, it doesn't make a lot of sense to create another governing body, but I do think it makes sense to empower the advisory board more.
Yeah, having
At the moment, I feel, you both have been on it, at the moment, I feel like it's just window dressing, they're not taking our suggestions into account at all. Period.
So, yeah, I think for a long time, it felt to me like it was a mechanism for the ferry service to push information to the towns and really nothing more. You didn't have, and you still don't have a lot of active participation. And I think probably when John and I started, when the tariffs were going on, is when things got a little bit, there was more pushback, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And then, John Emerson and I'm blanking on his name.
So,
Yeah, Phil. Was also ready to sort of upset the status quo there, but we're sort of back to not, and the advisory board doesn't really have any power, and the ferry service doesn't really listen to what they say. And so I think I'm on board with, I mean, it's certainly one of the things I think they mentioned in that bill is advisory board input on the budget, which we've talked about for quite a while about, hey, we want to be, the budget is what really decides what the tariffs are, and we want to be part of the budgeting process, and that has never happened.
Yep.
yeah, and I think that would be a very positive development too. I mean, the first time you find out when the budget is when you get the first quarter.
When you see
When you
it, see what's happened.
You're already halfway through not halfway, a quarter of the way through the fiscal year. And you get the P and L, and then, surprise, surprise, there's the budget. And it's the first time you see it, it's a fait accompli.
Yeah. There's no advance notice or ability to change anything.
And Gabe has raised, and I think, the whole idea of spending, God only knows how much money on the Margaret Chase Smith for quote repairs, unquote, which really, to my way of thinking, are capital expenditures is a big deal.
Yeah, it's a big deal for the bottom line and for the ticket prices.
Yeah, and unfunded pension liability is hit $1 million this year, so.
And the other side of that is I don't believe we're in for less repair bills going forward. Certainly if what happens is they're not replacing the boats and they don't have any funding or ability to replace boats, we're in for large scale repairs for the long haul. And so what you end up with is the state doesn't spend the money on the capital expenditures as I think is anticipated, and instead that money has to come from, at least half of it has to come from fare box revenue. And it's just a function of both poor planning and also some of which is the political and financial circumstances we find ourselves in right now. That's, I don't want to discount that, that's real too.
No, I think it's real that they only replace ferries when they have federal money. And traditionally, the last, I don't know, 20, 30 years, that's when they've replaced ferries.
So that is true. However, they haven't made the ask in advance, right? Up until recently, the ask wasn't put out there. There was no, so I think Mark Higgins was the one who started with a capital purchases plan for the ferry service, but he started after. I mean, you can't really start with any sort of maintenance and capital purchases plan when the boats are 25 years old.
Yeah.
All you're doing then is limping things along and making them last so you can continue to use them in the immediate future. It's not like let's plan for the future and here are the things we're gonna replace on this schedule so that the boats last forever. We're way past that. And so, we're just, the repair bills are just what they are, whatever they are, because the boats, there's no replacement at least coming at this point.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder if if the transportation committee could also, if it would be easier to talk them into the value of this, since they have seen so many ferry bills come before them, and that in an ideal world, a lot of these conversations happen with the DOT outside of the legislative process if the decision-making process is working as we would hope it would.
Mm-hmm.
Well, 841 could address that to some extent, you know, the whole idea, I mean, they did not have. Literally, I mean, Mark Higgins had kind of a capital strategy going, but it was not very specific, and here we are. So we might talk to Genevieve about mentioning that as well. And I know Bruce Van Note is concerned, he doesn't wanna have all the boats be built at the same time. And
Yeah,
I
he's
get-
right, he's right about
And
that too.
I don't disagree with him, but, you know. If Maggie gets to be 60 years old, that's gonna be a problem.
It's gonna be an expensive problem. I mean, it's gonna continue to, you're not gonna have any of the new technology for savings on fuel, you're gonna have repairs. And it's just not, it's not great.
Mm.
But again, I mean, like you said, it's really a lot better if what you can do is have a plan to replace the boats on a schedule so that. You know, every 5 years or whatever it ends up being, you have a new boat coming in to replace the oldest boat in the fleet. And then you don't end up with 1 year where you need 5 ferries, right?
It's gonna cost 40 million bucks.
Particularly if they cost $40 million, because then all of a sudden, and that's a problem that you know, every 25 years comes up again, right? Where you have to come up with $200 million to replace all your ferries,
Right.
or you don't, and you end up with where we are now. So,
So Monday at 4:30?
so Monday at 4:30, I'll try to circulate something tonight. With thoughts about, just sort of summarizing the conversation today to Genevieve, and I'll CC the entire committee. So that everybody has an opportunity also to chime in, it doesn't need to all come from me, so if there's other thoughts. But I'll try to summarize where I think we are and try to look to Genevieve for a little bit of guidance about how to move forward, and hopefully we'll have an idea about when the ferry day is gonna be. And whether or not we can get, or how many people we can get to Augusta, and also written testimony and talking with other islands too, so.
Oh, just before I forget, I did follow up with Genevieve, a big 841 had a change to have the review be by the Department of Public Safety, Office of Maine Medical Services, as opposed to the Office of Community Affairs. And she thought that was a rather innocuous change, so, for what it's worth.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know nothing about it. I did follow up. So, there you go. Okay, we'll see you Monday.
All right, well, entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Thanks for being here on the call, Fred.
Hey, thanks.
Have a good night.
guys.
Thank you. Never get an opportunity for